Thursday, November 10th, 1932. Day full to overflowing. Hoover has lost. As Raymond said he must, Franklin Roosevelt brings in Democratic rule by an enormous majority. Octavia is here to meet Jerome Green, but as she must go to her appointment, they cross her way and come up alone. I like them. He's frank about whatever he concludes, or rather says as much as he does say with truth. Franklin Roosevelt has known him since he was a boy. Green thought Roosevelt too much the politician, reserving unpopular opinions, etc. But Green is a Democrat and thought Roosevelt's election would help matters. He spoke wisely and generously of Hoover. Welcome to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Kaler. For reasons we will get into in another episode, when Elizabeth wrote this diary entry, Chinsegut had been placed in the hands of the federal government. Raymond and Margaret are still living there, but most of the land is being managed by the Department of Agriculture as an experimental station. They are studying ways to merge modern science development with farming, with the hopes it will increase productivity while decreasing a farmer's workload. It's a highly ambitious project, but Raymond loves a challenge and is eager to help them succeed. Although Raymond had worked for his friend Herbert Hoover's re-election, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt won, the Chinsegut program had not been derailed. In fact, FDR would pour more government resources into it than Raymond had even dreamed when Chinsegut became a site for the New Deal. This is an excerpt of a letter from Raymond to Elizabeth in January 1st, 1934, explaining. Dearest Big Sister, this is my first letter of the new year. Since my arrival here, it has been one drive with experts and officials of the Department of Agriculture of the U.S. and of the State Agricultural College of Florida. The rush is occasioned by the fact that another $50,000 has been given for relief of unemployment in the three counties, Hernando, Citrus, and Pasco, and the place of employment is on Chinsegut Hill Sanctuary. Think of 408 men being at work at one day on Chinsegut Hill Sanctuary. Fields, groves, roads, buildings, and forest lands. By 1937, Chinsegut would become a site for the Civilian Conservation Corps. Over 200 young men would pitch tents on the front lawn of the manor house and spend their days building bridges and barns and reservoirs. Several years ago, I created a graphic that shows all the projects they accomplished at Chinsegut, and I'll put it up on the website in case you want to look at it. But to really get a handle on the work of the CCC, we're going to talk to David Schmidt. He's the curator of the Florida Civilian Conservation Corps Museum, located at Highlands Hammock State Park in Sebring. David, welcome. Would you introduce yourself to the audience? Just tell us what it is that you do.
Well, yes, as you said, I am David Schmidt. I am curator of the State of Florida Civilian Conservation Corps Museum in Sebring at Highlands Hammock State Park, which is, of course, whether you know it or not, the first state park in Florida.
So what is, for people that don't have a background in this, just explain to us what the Civilian Conservation Corps was.
Civilian Conservation Corps was Franklin Roosevelt's premier program of all the ABC alphabet soup programs that he developed during his presidency. He had a similar program to the CCC in the state of New York. New York, much after the turn of the last century, already had problems with clear cutting of trees and problems with erosion, farmland that had been completely used up and abandoned. And so he had established a program for young men right at the beginning of the Depression so that they could get a job and they would not only learn some husbandry skills and some forestry skills, but they'd also then be able to plant trees and then replant them all over the state of New York. So then that was a very, very successful program. So immediately when he became president in March of 1933, he initiated the legislation for the Civilian Conservation Corps, which would be a similar program. It would be for young men from 17, even though some lied to get in, up to their early 20s. And then they would go to camps all over the country and engage in, primarily at the very beginning, it would be all forestry kinds of things. But then after the program matured, it got into some more building stuff and parks and that kind of thing. It was as I said, his most successful program. The camp, something over about 3.5 million young men participated, and during that 8-9 years between 1933 and 1942, right at the beginning of the war, and maybe a little bit after that, they established huge amounts of most good state parks in any state in the United States were pretty much CCC parks. They did a lot of forestry stuff that we don't even know about, fire roads. Before we had prescribed burning in Florida, we had forest fires all the time. And so in some states they still do. So they fought forest fires, but they learned, all sorts of stuff. And if you talk to most of those guys aren't here anymore, unfortunately, but when you could talk to them, many of them would tell you that their experience in the CCC was the making of them as men. And it was for some of them, it was the best time of their life.
Wow. Well, and that leads into my next question, which was, if it was just for a job training thing, or was it just a way to temporarily employ people? So just to expand on that a little bit, but you're saying that it kind of was setting people up for their future.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it was most certainly. Roosevelt believed that the two greatest assets that the country had was our obvious natural beauty and our natural resources. And then the second most valuable thing was our young people. And so to let them just lie fallow during that time and not be able to get a job was just not going to happen. And so he also believed, as he put the program together, that the Depression would not last forever. So it was incumbent upon the country, while they're getting the work out of these young men, to also train them for a job after they got out. And so depending on where you went for your CCC experience, you could be trained for all sorts of things. For example, I thought it was interesting that at Chinsegut, Mr. Robbins was there when they had the CCC program. Mm-hmm. So I believe he even went out and taught a journalism class with the CCC boys when they were at his house. And then that way, some of those guys, I believe, went on to be relatively respectful journalists. Mm-hmm. So you've got that. If you didn't, there were very few people. I believe that somewhere around 40,000 CCC boys came into the program illiterate. And so those guys were taught to read and write. And then if you had dropped out of school, and that was not an uncommon practice during the Depression, when you some kids didn't have the right clothes, and it was an embarrassment to even try to go to school. So they would drop out and try to find a job to help the family. They obviously could get a high school diploma. And then the trades happened, and it just depended on where you were. It might be husbandry, it might be crafts. At Hillsborough River, for example, they had a very extensive program in sort of building trades, plumbing, electricity, home heating. Here at Sebring, our program was more based on office skills, accounting, typing, bookkeeping, but then also at the very beginning, a lot of these classes were taught by the Army, because the Army ran the program at the very beginning in the 30s, in the 33, 34. And then as it matured, you got more local people to come in. And some places, depending where they were, got student teachers from the universities would come in and teach English, the actual school, what we consider school subjects. But then you'd get a lot of local people that would become involved in teaching the trades or the crafts. And for example, here, even though our focus was on business, there also was a local blacksmith who really wanted to come and share his blacksmithing skills. Mm-hmm. So you could actually learn to be a blacksmith in Sebring. And I think that was common in other places. Sometimes you had a skill that was just sort of out there that just happened because you had a local person that would come in and teach that class. So it was really meant to get good things out of the kids, the boys then, and then make sure that they had a job after that.
Would the local instructors have been paid as well, or was that something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, they were paid. They were paid. And like I said, the Army started, but after that, you get local people that became involved. For example, here we had the Altvatters, Alan Altvatter, the first, and that whole family was involved. And then you had local people that was, the unfortunate thing is that the camp at Chinsegut was only there a year. Mm-hmm. So it really didn't have a chance to mature into what you say some of the programs that were multi-year programs. And those local people, because you didn't want to make people mad, the powers that be mad, so you lost your camp, right? Because that would brought a huge amount of money into the local economy, buying food, materials and stuff like that. So yeah, a lot of local people then took over the jobs normally that director jobs, the teaching jobs, the supervisory jobs. Most of those were local. And then as some CCC boys, since you only had the camp in Chinsegut one year, you could only stay either 6 months or 12 months. But the norm was pretty much 3 terms, maybe 4. Some guys stayed the whole 4 years, and they might stay at one camp for 4 years, or they might go to 4 different camps. Every 6 months, they'd move someplace else. A lot of them. We actually have one person that I had the records for, who did 18 months. He did 3 tours at 3 different places. Then he went home for 10 months, and then he came back and signed up again and went out to California. Now, I don't know whether that was common, but there is at least one case where somebody went back to work and they enjoyed it so much. So
I found a letter this weekend that goes back to 1934, the beginning of 34, and Raymond's writing to his sister telling him that they just got a grant through the WPA and they were going to have $50,000 for that facility that was supposed to be for Hernando and Citrus County residents. What would the difference have been between what the CCC was doing a year later and what the WPA stuff was?
The WPA was depending on where you were during the Depression era, it was either Works Progress Administration or Works Projects Administration. Okay. And that was a much larger program. It on one side, it provided work for theater people, artists, musicians, and stuff like that. And those people would go around the country and perform or, do art projects, work in the schools and stuff like that. That was extremely expensive and it was extremely difficult to manage. Mm-hmm. And so those programs didn't last very long. But the other WPA projects were construction projects, and that's probably what that letter referred to. Yeah. And but that was also an extremely successful program, because almost every small to medium-sized to big town in the United States got something out of that WPA project. And that was to provide work for mostly unskilled workers who were chronically unemployed, who had families, and so you'd get that money. And most places got a post office. If there's anything classic, it's the WPA post office. Okay. When I first came to Sebring and I was looking for the post office, I drove around downtown until I saw the classic rectangular building with a door in the middle and 2 windows on either side, and I said, "Aha! There's the post office." Only to go in and discover that it was actually the police station, and that the new post office had been built across the street and down a block. And so that's a common common misconception, because that's the interesting thing. All the things that were built, especially these post offices, they're 90 years old or approaching 90 years old. And most of them are still in business. They're either post offices. When you go around in Florida, especially in the central corridor of the state, that's where most of the classic design post offices are. They're all still post offices. You go to the coast and they tend to have been repurposed. Like the city's grown bigger, and so the post office has been sold off for something else. And but you could also get high schools. There was a high school built in Key West, which is now the city hall. Some other places they've been renovated and become lawyers' offices or other things like that. But for example, in Tampa, the Tampa bandshell that's on Daytona Beach. The Daytona Beach bandshell was a WPA project. In Tampa, the Tampa airport, the international airport, the original airport in Tampa was a WPA project.
Oh, wow.
And then it was rebuilt, torn down and rebuilt, I believe in the 60s or early 70s, to the much bigger airport that it is now. The airport in Bradenton, Sarasota is a WPA. That was originally a WPA airport. It was finished just in time for when World War II started, and the Army came in and took it over. The Army Air Corps took it over, and that's one thing that saved it, because it had so much land, and then the Army acquired more land, so that's why the city didn't grow around it, so they were able to keep the airport. The WA project, I can't even begin. There were some, for example, depending on the primary industry in an area, that sometimes drove a WPA project. Like if you go to the East Coast, then you had shipbuilding was the primary driver. So you have some boats. Actually, there's a Coast Guard cutter that was sunk in the Gulf off of Fort Myers. That was built by the WPA in Maryland during the 30s, and it did its service, and then it moved on that. So it's they're all over the place. Fort Jefferson, out where they kept Captain Mudd, who set the assassin of President Lincoln's leg. He was put in prison out there, and after that it started to deteriorate. And President Roosevelt, well, that's one of the first things he did was make that a national landmark, and then he shipped a bunch of guys out there on WPA project to renovate that. So it's all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, and the one thing I think it's pretty consistent is that they were built very sturdily. I was giving a tour at Chinsegut yesterday, and the CCC cabins that are still there from 1935 were supposed to be temporary structures, and they are still there and hanging tight. I'm like, this is better than houses that we're building today.
Right. All those barracks buildings or those office buildings, some of them were classroom buildings. They were basically shipped in on a flat car, on the railroad, and then they were taken to wherever they needed to be put up, and then they'd build a floor and then slap the walls up and slap the roof on. And then a lot of them were just tar paper over some kind of a frame. Yeah. And the fact that they're still in business. I know in Colorado, the Red Rocks Amphitheater, which is west of Denver, was a CCC project, and they still have their camp there. So those have weathered Colorado winters, those barracks buildings, those tar paper barracks buildings, and they're all still there.
Wow.
Too. So
almost 100 years. That's nuts.
It's something else. Yeah. It was an incredible program.
So talk to me about the kinds of things that Florida specifically would have had the CCC camps working on. What kind of projects?
Well, at the very beginning, because Roosevelt, it's probably the fastest that any federal program ever came to fruition. I mean, he introduced the legislation right after his inauguration in March of 1933, and then by May, the first camp opened in Virginia, and then our first camp down here was in June, And then there was the first camp here in Sebring opened in August of 1933. So it was that fast. The very first programs, since they basically were looking for stuff, were forestry programs like FDR had done in the state of New York. And he wasn't the only one. There were several other governors who had initiated similar programs during the Depression. So most of them at the beginning would be planting trees, learning how to fight fires, putting in fire roads, and that kind of stuff. Then as it matured, well, you had another thing that happened. Florida during the early 30s, was an open range state. So you could just let your cattle sort of aimlessly wander around the state. And then I think it was 1935, 36, there was a serious tick infestation in cattle. So the state came back and said, hey, you can't do this anymore. So then the CCC got involved with local landowners putting up fences. And then that also is when you start getting the state parks. You have people that want to volunteer. The state park, there wasn't really a state park organization in Florida until the mid-30s. And prior to that, anything that had to do with parks or forests went through the Forestry Service. And so people were starting to throw land at them and stuff. And then that's where you get the state parks developing. And those were primarily the biggest drivers. The other ones all were for want of a better word, they were nature kinds of things. So when you have the buildings going on, building, it was mostly the state parks, the 8 state parks in the state.
Okay. You mentioned the ticks on the cattle. Is that where the cattle dipping came in? One of the projects I sent you that they did at Chinsegut was dipping the cattle.
That is correct. You had to fence your cattle in, and then you had to start dipping them. It's interesting. Over in by Sarasota, where Myakka State Park is, a lot of the land from Myakka came from the Potter Palmer family from Chicago that owned the Palmer House Hotel. Right. And Bertha and Potter were very great art collectors. So the Art Institute of Chicago has a huge collection of Impressionist art, and it all basically came from the Palmers. And after Bertha was much younger than Potter, and after he died, she came down to Florida, and she and her brother, the family is called Honore, and they were from New Orleans, and she and her brother bought 80,000 acres of land to the east of Sarasota and started running cattle over there. And if you go over and you do the tour, the tour of Myakka, they'll talk about dipping cattle and how she got, her feet wet. And it's funny because the only pictures you ever find of her is when she was queen of Chicago society, and she's decked out in diamonds and everything. And then to realize that she, started running cattle, and she ran it like with an iron hand, just like I'm sure she did everything else. But that's interesting because they actually had to dip cattle, and they were involved in that later on. But she was definitely that's one of the things that happened. Yeah, she was definitely queen of society in Chicago. And actually, when Raymond Robbins was in Chicago, he always stayed at the Palmer House. That's where he had his mail sent. But they have good brownies. Actually, the Palmer Ranch program, the corporation, I believe, is still in business, even though they're Palmers, because that whole area that's on the east side of Sarasota is all growing, and so there's the effects of some of those things are still with us. So besides the cattle dipping, I'd sent you the list of the projects that they were doing there at Chinsegut while they were there. Are those normal sorts of projects that they were working on? So the stuff at Chinsegut with the cottage and some of the bridges and things like that was pretty much standard when you looked at what they were building in the state parks and a few other places that they worked. The thing that's fascinating about the Chinsegut program is that that's one of the only programs I've ever found where since they had given that property away in lieu of their taxes, and they were able to stay there, that's one of the only places where you have the CCC actually living on property or working on a property where the people are still living there.
Right.
You had the farming and stuff like that, but you get the feeling when you read about what went on is that there was a natural interface between the Robbins family and the CCC while they were there. And I just find that very interesting.
Yeah, and I'm still looking for a picture, but we know that before they built some of the structures that they were literally camping on the front lawn. So when Raymond and Margaret got out of bed in the morning and looked out their front window, there would have been 200 men, sleeping right there in front of them.
Sleeping in tents and stuff. Yeah. Like I say, it's fascinating. That's literally a one-off project. There may be something else in the rest of the United States, but it obviously is something that's interesting in Florida that we had here that probably didn't exist other places.
Yeah, no,
and I think that's it speaks to that. The Robbins obviously were politically connected, and they knew the right people, and they were sort of power couple, especially with his sister. And so, that's probably why that happened.
Right.
Because a lot of things, it's like, what's going to happen after? And knowing the trajectory of the property after they were gone and the CCC wasn't there, and the fact that it went to university, it's like you get the sense, and maybe you have a better handle on this. What was the intent of doing all this? Because they were only there for a year, and it was sort of some fix-up stuff, and they put in some pavilions and that kind of thing. But does anybody know what the plans were for after that? I mean, we know it went belonged to the university, but was that the intent at the time? Yeah,
I mean, after the CCC moved out, USDA started managing a lot of the farm area. And right. I think there definitely was also some shakeup in the administration and who was running it. And I'm still trying to get to the bottom of who ticked off who. But it was an interesting situation because Raymond was very close friends with Hoover, and that's how the deal started. Was they were trying to work out that deal, and then Hoover loses the election, and Raymond had been campaigning for Hoover, so it made it a little more complicated. But Margaret's sister, Mary, was very close with the FDR administration. So because of the family connection, they were able to still kind of make it work. And then Raymond ends up having a great relationship with FDR, but initially he didn't because he was one of FDR's worst nightmares because he was out on the campaign for Hoover. So, no, it's very interesting. But I think they knew that they wanted it, but there was definitely not a cohesive agreement on what they were going to do with it once they got it.
Right. But it was basically agriculture. I think it's actually labeled as initially an agriculture project. Right. It didn't have the normal CCC because they had, it was very simple. If it was an SP, whatever, obviously it was a state park. If it was an NF, it was a national forest. And I think there's an ag designation like Ag 3 or something like that for Chinsegut. When they first took it over, I think the intent was that it was going to have some agricultural importance.
Yeah, I mean, they wanted to figure out how to modernize farming techniques in a way that would make it, more successful for people to farm. And they did a lot of experiments with different things to try to figure out how to help farmers improve what they were doing. So I think probably when you look at the CCC projects, and we'll put that in the show notes, that they were to make the experiment station run better, so that once they left, then it was functioning better as the experimental station.
Yeah, okay, that makes logical sense. That really does.
This is during the Jim Crow era. So how did that work with the camps? Were they segregated? Were they integrated?
Okay, the Jim Crow, obviously, Florida during that period of time was a huge influence. Since Florida also was the second largest population state where the guys that signed up for the CCC stayed in Florida. So you had a lot of African Americans that stayed here. The camps were segregated in the fact that Mayaca is the one that's thrown up most frequently as an example of integration, but it really wasn't, in the fact that when there were African Americans there were African Americans there, and when there were white people there were white people there, and there wasn't very much of mixing there. Several years ago, I had a woman who was doing some investigative journalism. She was actually looking at just that issue, and she remembered she actually couldn't find very much, and she talked to some of the older African Americans in Sarasota that remembered the program out at Mayaca, and they talked about how it wasn't what a lot of people thought it was. That being said, there were places where there were integrated. You might have several African Americans in a corps. My understanding is that happened here in Sebring, and a lot of the local people didn't like that. And the local managers, administrators who were working at the CCC camp basically told the city fathers, look, we're either going to have these people or we may potentially lose the camp. Now, is that what you really want to do? And so, they became smarter, and they didn't. So there's no clear, policy. I know when you look at pictures from the rest of the country, especially in the north and out west, there's almost always African Americans peppered through the boys, the group pictures that they take. Down here, no, that just wouldn't happen.
Right.
Now, unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but Jim Crow was Jim Crow.
Right. It's a reality of the time for sure. In the camp life itself, were there other amenities, or did they just have somewhere to sleep and somewhere to eat, or were there things they could do while they were there?
Oh, yeah. It was actually, I don't want to call it like scout camp, but it almost was. You had obviously a place to sleep. You obviously had a place to eat, and the food was incredible. I mean, that was another piece. It's not uncommon, and they always talk about that, for guys who stayed for a long period of time to have gained 10, 15, 20 pounds, because they were just so thin when they got in. They didn't have, or the standard rule was take as much food as you want, but you better eat it all. And so it was not uncommon at the very beginning when they first got there to literally make themselves sick, because some of those boys, it had been ages since they'd had really enough food. They were almost consistently hungry. So you have great food, and it just depended on the organization of the camp, whether they ate in a mess hall all the time or they truck the food out. For example, here, the camp was at a different place from the park where the boys were working. And so they would have breakfast and do morning activities, and then they'd take trucks and they'd bring them out to the park. And then at lunchtime, they would bring the food out. And I've got a couple pictures that are great, because you can see the truck, and then you've got the guys all snaked out behind, ready for food. And then they went back for dinner. And then that's when you have all this other stuff going on. They mostly work just 5 days. So on the weekends, some guys would get passes and go into town, and or some I think there was enough, I don't know what, maybe 8 or 10 local people at Chinsegut, so those guys could come back to Brooksville and visit their families, and that wasn't uncommon, especially as it matured. When the Army was in control at the very beginning, that was almost treated like going AWOL. And you didn't get back in. Literally, if you left, you didn't get back in. They didn't hunt you down, but you didn't get back
that
in.
Was the end.
As it matured, that happened all the time. I've heard actually have a series of documentations from one guy's entire career in the CCC, and he was in Ohio, and his home was really close. So he went home for his 18th birthday and was gone for a couple of days. And when he came back, instead of slapping him on the wrist and sending him away, they just said, okay, you get more KP, kind of deal. And then you got to remember, you've got a bunch of hormonal young teenage and young 20s. So you have a lot of stuff going on. Baseball, boxing was a very common experience, not just for the fun of boxing, but it was also a way to settle disputes between guys, put them in a boxing ring, give them boxing gloves, and then off they go. But, they played baseball and, all had stuff like that to do. They also had places to read. You had, as I said, you have classes going on. So they had reading, some kind of a library. It may not have been a huge place, but things like that. So, and you had also a side, almost every CCC camp had a publication. And as with Chinsegut, I can't remember, Chinsegut Star or something like that, I think was their paper. And Mr. Robbins helped them, basically get that thing started. And that was not uncommon. I mean, we had the one that we had at Sebring Camp, I think won some journalism awards. And if you look at those, I've been to a couple other places in Florida where, somebody kept everything. Mm-hmm. And some of those have all of those camp journals and stuff like that. And it's really interesting. It's like having a small town newspaper, and they talk about everything that went on. And I think another thing that's funny is because of the heat down here, there's a lot of mention of guys going skinny dipping and stuff like that, and a lot of those papers. But no, they kept people happy, and as I said, it was the work. It was for many of those men, they will tell you when they were alive that it was one of the best times of their life. Mm-hmm. So I think that if it had been just sleep and work and eat, I don't think they would have felt that way. But I think, some had friendships. I've got some things in the museum where guys kept like a journal, and they had all their friends, everybody they knew at the thing that they became friends with, they'd get their addresses and stuff like that, so they could follow up with them after that. So it was way more than just sleep, eat, work.
Right. Well, and I think we didn't touch on this yet, so we should probably cover it. But the way that it worked is generally they were single men. They were paid, I believe, $30 a month. They were allowed to keep 5. The rest of it was going home to wherever their family was, for their parents.
Well, it's whoever they designated when you joined up. That was a form you filled out as your designation. Okay. So it could go to a grandmother. It could go to your most of it obviously went home to their parents. So.
But they, all their expenses were paid. They had the housing and their meals, and did the clothing, was that part of it, or did they pay for that?
Yes, clothes.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up. Some of the journals, that's one of the first things they'll enter is they'll literally list all the clothes that they got. And it would, in some cases, it's almost like, wow, I got 2 pairs of boots. I've never had a new pair of boots in my whole life. Or I got to sleep on sheets or better yet, I got to sleep in a bed all by myself for the first time in my life.
Wow.
Or I have sheets, or I have towels. They got completely kitted out. And at the very beginning, unfortunately, a lot of this stuff was left over from World War I. So It was, wool uniforms and wool blankets and stuff like that. But, later on, and they got a nice little, we have several of these in the museum. It was a nice little box. And inside the box was all their toiletry items. They got a razor and toothbrush and toothpaste and shaving soap and all those kinds of things that they would need. And then the 2 uniforms. They got work clothes. They got hat, shoes. Basically anything that they were going to need during the time. They also had a dress uniform. The original ones obviously were wool, and the other ones later on. Because if you look at group photos. They also, towards the end, a lot of the bigger camps also got sort of almost like a high school yearbook kind of thing.
Yes, we had a yearbook. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, the yearbooks, and if you look at them, they're all dressed up and they've got their dress uniforms on. Okay. And so, they really got taken care of. And then the upside of that was you have then, when you're done, about 3.5 million young men who are healthy and they're well fed. And they're trained, they have occupations, they know how to work as a group, they know how to take orders. And so that's how we marched into World War II.
Right.
So we can't overlook the benefit to the country at that point in time of having this pool of young men.
That is really interesting. I never thought about it, but that makes so much sense. I mean, that is
Oh,
exactly
yeah,
who
it
would have
does.
ended up in the war. Yeah.
Yeah. And there were places. Almost all of the guys obviously went to the war, even if
Yeah.
they were there early. There are such stories where some places they just marched them right from the CCC camp right down to the recruitment office.
Wow.
And or or they'll tell you I'm trying. It was right before the pandemic. We had still some veterans alumni down here, and we put on uh, we have a festival every year. It's the CC Festival at the park. And so one of the things we did is we sort of had a little panel discussion. We got the four of them there. One guy was like pushing 100. All the rest of them were in their mid 90s, and they you talk to them, and one poor guy sort of nodded off, but they all had these incredible stories. And one guy he remembered that that was cold when they got off the train when they got there. They took him to eat Italian spaghetti, and the guy sitting next to him turned to him. He says, "I can't believe you can remember that." He goes, "I can't even remember whether I went to the bathroom this morning." But then when it got his turn, then all of a sudden that had jogged his memory,
Right.
of what had gone on for him. And then all four of those guys eventually went to the United States Navy. And so, they all pretty much, and a lot of them will tell you too, or some of the documentation we have is whatever they were trained for in the CCC camp, many of them went into those job positions. A lot of them didn't have fighting positions. They had office management kind of stuff that they did when they got into war. One guy drove a truck during his CCC time, and then after he was out of the CCC was a truck driver, and then when he went into the service he was a truck driver, and then after he got out, his whole life he drove truck.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how that followed them through even when they went into the service and then after they got out.
Our site manager at Chinsegut, Ross Lamro, I'm sure you know him, is a big collector of memorabilia from CCC. What kinds of stuff, other than the clothing, were the guys using their money on, the little trinkets and things that they had? There seemed to be a lot of branding for an organization that...
Oh, yes. I have a box. Actually, right now, I've got an exhibit out, and it's basically that kind of stuff. It's rings, pins, a lot of tobacco memorabilia. I actually did an exhibit once on all the tobacco when smoking wasn't a bad habit kind of thing. And because you could buy cigarettes for like 15 or 20 cents. They had most of the bigger camps too had like a camp store, so you could go and get stuff there.
Okay.
So a lot of cigarette stuff, cigarette boxes, cigarette cases, lighters with the CCC logo on them. A lot of, and then they had also the classic. I would say the two things, if he's got these two in his collection, he's a true collector. They apparently sold, and we have one of them that's in pretty good shape. The other one's not. It's like a silk pillow that's got CCC on it, and then it's got all these pictures of CCC stuff, and it's got fringe around the edge of it. And apparently that was something that was available that you could get and take home or send home, or if you were going home, you bought one. And then the other one would be the classic CCC pennant.
Okay.
Those are felt, and they don't hold up very well. We've got a couple of them that some critters have been nibbling around the edges over time, and they're pretty deteriorated. But books, you could get. They had some CCC books, so there was more than enough stuff for them to spend their $5 on.
Right.
So
I feel like the silk pillow would be something you'd get beat up for. Maybe you were just buying that for your mom. I don't know.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is I just discovered recently. I was on Etsy looking for something, and something popped up on my page, and there's actually a CCC, I think it's called CCC Camp store or something like that. They have an Etsy store where they sell the pennants. I mean, obviously reproductions,
right.
But that they sell pennants, they sell bandanas, they have the bumper stickers, CCC bumper stickers, and stuff like that. So I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that here we are, and this is the 90th anniversary of the CCC. That's another thing that's important, that here we are 90 years away, and there's still a little store on Etsy that's selling CCC stuff, and they're apparently doing well. We have a store, a camp store at Highlands Hammock. And so I actually contacted the Etsy guy and I said, hey, we've got this store. We maybe want to be interested in marketing some of your projects. And they're just happy as a clam because they want this to be very successful. Yeah. So I think it's interesting that even that far along, there's still interest in the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Right. No, it's interesting, the stories that he tells, the amount of competition that there is when he's bidding on things. So he does a lot of stuff on eBay and you would think you could just walk in and grab it, but apparently, there's a lot of people collecting these things.
We have somebody stumbled across one of our board members for our citizen support organization, our CSO, found a license plate from Highlands Hammock, the state park, which was, and it's number one because we're the oldest state park, the first state park, and it was a license plate that they actually had on the cars at Highlands Hammock, and he bought that, and it was in the hundreds of dollars he paid for this old rusty license plate. Right. So you're right. There's competition for that CCC, the CCC memorabilia, which when you think about it, you think, oh, there's a bunch of old stuff that guys donated. But when they give you that, and they bring me stuff at the museum, that's the one thing that's the two most fascinating things about this job, and it's actually volunteer. I don't get paid for it. I was actually a special education teacher in my previous life, but I also had a history degree, and my cognate was FDR. So when I came down here and they needed docents at the museum, and I was just down here for the winter, and I was going to just go in and volunteer. Well, the next thing I know, they're like, well, our curator's leaving. You're better trained than anybody else to do this. And so I'm like, okay, so I bought a house here and sold my house in Indiana, and I've been here ever since.
That's amazing.
But, people, they, especially after the festival and at other times, they'll bring you these treasures that they've kept, from grandpa or great grandpa or somebody, and they've obviously meant something to these people because they've cherished these things and they've kept them. And it may be a stack of papers, it may be a uniform top, it may be a bugle, it may be something, and they'll bring them to the museum because they don't know what else to do with them. And sometimes they don't even have anything to do with Florida. But how do you say no to people when they're giving you these possessions that have meant so much, that they've kept for so long? And so that's why we've got the collection that we've got. So, and I mean you just appreciate those people and the stories they tell and the people you meet. They've all got some connection usually, and if it's nothing more than they grew up and they went to a CCC park, when they were kids, and now they found out it was a CCC park, and they realized how rich that whole heritage was from that. And you got to remember, it's only like 8 years, it's 1933 through maybe 41, because of the 42 stuff, that was stuff they were cleaning up basically because everybody was going to war by then. Yeah. And so that all that got accomplished in such a short period of time, and it's all still in good shape. So it's a phenomenal. It's just a great. I enjoy every day I work and the people I talk to.
Enough that you moved from Indiana to Florida to work for free.
Yes, I did.
You enjoyed it that much. If somebody wants to learn more about the CCC, what is your favorite resource to direct people to?
Well, obviously, you can come to my museum and you can visit us at the museum. But I think that what I find interesting is I put together, I would say, just go to Amazon and type in Civilian Conservation Corps. Be careful about just using CCC.
Yeah, then you get China.
Yeah, sometimes, you're going to get someplace you don't want to be.
Yeah.
But if you do Civilian Conservation Corps, there are, huge pages of books, but there's a couple that are really good. There's one called Nature's New Deal by a guy named Neil Maher, and that shows up on that page. Fighting Forests by O'Connell Pearson is another one. And then there's actually one that's a compilation. It's called CCC, and a guy named Charles Rivers edited it. And it's actually a bunch of interviews, pictures, other resources. It's got a bibliography for other books and stuff like that. And then you're going to find that in certain states, there were actually books, or a lot of people wrote memories of the CCC. And so you can find just about anything you want. Probably the most common book is called FDR's Tree Army. And it's mostly pictures. So if you want background information, then you need to get someplace where it's going to talk about because while it was really wonderful, you've got to remember that FDR funded almost all of his New Deal stuff with money that should have gone to the War Department, as it was called then, not the Defense Department, but the War Department. And there's supposedly a story, apocryphal or not, that he got into a huge argument with Douglas MacArthur when this money wasn't going where it normally went. And then MacArthur, supposedly he stormed out of the White House, and I'm trying to picture that because the president's office had been built, the Oval Office, and where did he storm out of?
Right.
But as things got dicier in Europe, with Hitler and everything, the Congress was less generous, let's say, in giving money for the programs. And the CCC was one of the last. The WPA building programs and the CCC were some of the last programs that the funding dried up on. But that started to happen, and that made it a little difficult. But they were still there and everything. But there's politics behind it too. Sure. When you read about that, you're going to get the full story of what really happened.
Thank you so much, David. This was wonderful. Yeah. And I love talking to people that are passionate about things because they help us be passionate about them too when you didn't even know that you should care, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, listen, thanks a lot. It's really great to talk to you guys because I love to talk about the CCC, and this is another one of those hidden stories, because you got 3.5 million guys, and there's just a 3.5 million stories, I guess. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of them are lost, and that's the sad part about it. But
that was great talking to you, David.
Yeah, it was wonderful talking to you guys too.
The CCC Camp at Chinsegut would last only 1 year, but their projects are still in use today. Most notable is the memorial fountain located to the west of the manor house. That portion of the property is now managed by Florida A&M University, given to them during the Obama administration as the largest land grant ever made to a historically Black university. But that is a story for another podcast. On the next episode of the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast, we will learn why Brooksville is famous for tangerines. Thank you for listening to the Elizabeth Robbins Diary podcast, a creation and production of Brooksville Main Street, a nonprofit focused on economic redevelopment through historic preservation and placemaking. The podcast is made possible with the help of a generous grant from Florida Humanities and the brilliant minds of our guest experts like David Schmidt. Would you please consider following and rating the podcast? By following us, you'll be sure not to miss an episode, and rating is a super helpful way to help us spread the word and support all the hard work of the following people. Leif Thomason of Odd Life Studios produced this content, as well as editing, mixing, and mastering it. Tom and Patria Dye opened Profound Revelation Studios in downtown Brooksville, allowing us to create this content right in the heart of our city. The docents of the Chinsegut Hill Historic Site and Andrea Reed generously provided research support and advice. The Civilian Conservation Corps workers, who built 2 temporary structures, a wash house and an overseer's cabin. Those temporary structures are still standing 88 years later and give us a glimpse into life in the Depression era and are a fine example of men who took pride in their work and built something to last. Barry Meindl of DeBar Design created our lovely graphics. Elisa Babor of Roots Creative Co. designed an amazing website and social media. Ross Lamoureux of Chinsegut Hill Historic Site for his vast knowledge on all things CCC. He has helped me understand so much more about this program so that I knew the right questions to ask David in preparing for this interview. And according to David's standards, Ross is a true collector as he has multiple CCC pennants and silk pillows. When you come to Chinsegut, be sure to ask to see some of Ross's camp reproduction items he has built and sewn. Randy Olson of Live Oak Theater wrote and performed our theme song, Time is Whispering. Thales Library of New York University gave us access to Elizabeth's collection. And Independent Age kindly granted permission for us to quote from that collection. Find out more about them at independentage.org. And of course, Elizabeth Robbins, who saw the value of Chinsegut and used her savings to purchase it, kind of like the man in the Bible who found the pearl of great price. Over 100 years after her sacrificial purchase, our generation is able to wander those grounds and discover evidence of the work of the generations before us. Things like cattle dipping troughs that ended up not being such a great idea, as well as culverts and bridges and water towers and even fire pits we still benefit from today. May we all be as conscious as she was of how our present actions impact those who come after us.